Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Up Close on METV. I'm Charles Clapsaddle, Station Manager for Manatee Educational Television. And on this edition of Up Close, we're very privileged to have with us two individuals who make a great difference in our community and to talk about a very important organization that's making differences each and every day. Please welcome Major Connie Shingledecker with the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. Connie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Charles. It's a pleasure.
And the CEO of Hope Family Services, Laurel Lynch. Laurel, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting us, Charles.
Now, the issue today is the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team, and it's a very critical sounding organization. And Connie, if we could start with you, what is the Fatality Review Team?
Well, it's a group of individuals from different backgrounds, law enforcement, state attorney's office, Hope Family Services, other individuals within the community that provide services to domestic violence circumstances. And what we do is we review cases in the past where a domestic violence homicide occurred in hopes that we can understand the dynamics of that particular case, look for commonalities, and look for prevention efforts for future cases.
Now, is this something that's fairly recent within the community here, or something that's kind of a reorganization of?
Yes, it's a reorganization. Several years ago, I think Manatee and Sarasota together had a domestic violence fatality review team, and then it sort of went by the wayside, not meeting as often. And I sit on a local child death review team, and I thought how beneficial it would be to look at some of our domestic violence related homicides. And I had an opportunity to sit down with Laurel and say, let's work together to get this back on track, and so we did.
Now, why is it important to have a review team? Obviously, the Sheriff's Office does a complete review of homicides and everything, but why a domestic violence review team?
Well, we may do a really good job at looking at our homicides and moving forward for prosecution, but what are we doing to understand the dynamics within our own community of what's taking people's lives, and then what opportunities do we have to understand, could we make improvements? Are there issues, systems issues, court system, injunction systems, law enforcement systems that lend itself to improving what we do, and that's what we're looking at.
Now, Laurel, as a involved partner in looking at domestic violence and being your major emphasis, well, how important is this the fatality review team important to you and your organization?
Well, it's critical in terms of prevention. We've been, for lack of a better way to say it, patching people up and sending them back out into the world for many, many years. Hope's been around since 1979, and the first laws that changed the way we as a community looked at domestic violence have been on the books for a long time, and yet people are still getting killed. So what are we missing? And one of the things I find fascinating is this model was taken from the airline industry, and people are stunned when they find that out, because you think, really? What's that got to do with family violence? But what the airline industry did, because it's so rare to have an airplane fall out of the sky and there'd be problems, they have the little black box. They all sit down, the manufacturer of the plane, the air traffic controllers, the pilot or the person the pilot was talking to, and they look at all these different components. And one of the things that I thought was just brilliant was it wasn't a finger pointing exercise. It wasn't about, well, now you, Hope boy, you didn't keep her in the shelter long enough, or gee whiz, law enforcement, you didn't investigate those 3 calls that you had on the Friday nights prior to this homicide, or gee whiz this or gee whiz that. And so taking all this information, and we're one of, there's several fatality review teams that look at domestic violence throughout Florida, and you look at it in a cumulative way, it truly stands out for us, some of the trends. For instance, we know that a batterer who professes homicide or has, suicide or some suicidal ideation is statistically more likely to kill the partner than someone who's just a bully and mad because dinner's not on time, or you parked a car crooked in the driveway, or something equally mundane. Those who are suicidal statistically jump in areas of risk higher what we call lethality, greater lethality. And so some of the things, I mean, as you know, I've been doing this for a very long time, and I thought I had a pretty good handle on these families and the dynamics and what was happening. I mean, it's been most of my life I've worked in the domestic violence field. And from the fatality review teams, one of the things we learned is statistically, a non-biological child in the family increases the risk.
Really?
I may have wondered about that anecdotally, but I could never have stood up and said this is a risk factor. But today we know it in fact is. So that's the kind of thing, you know, a woman comes into our office, or a man, we have a man that we're sheltering as we speak. It's rare, but a person comes in and they start telling us about their family, and they say, oh yes, my partner's been Baker acted because he's suicidal. Yes, there is you know, I have my son is his stepson. Now we start looking at this pattern, and one thing that we've also cautioned people is it is still as much art as it is science. It is statistically just a snapshot of where somebody is on a continuum of violence, but it's no guarantee that they're going to act or not act.
Right. So, and the accumulation of this data as you review it and analyze it, it must be a great tool for law enforcement, Major, as you look at that and say, well, we're seeing patterns here. So if you're called out on repeat calls, you know, does that analysis of data help you with the training of law enforcement?
Yes, actually we've just started with some additional training that focuses on primary aggressor. It focuses on the lethality or risk assessment to the individual. And so what we wanted the officer to do when they arrived is sort of have a better understanding of what it is that the domestic violence fatality review team has discovered and recognize who may be at most risk so that they can help us to identify who those individuals are. And one of the things that we found when we were looking at mainly murder-suicide cases, because those are closed book, you know, close the book, don't have to wait on a court case, you know, coming to trial. We found that in most 95 or greater, almost 100% of those cases, the victim had never reached out to Hope Services. And we know that when they're most amenable to reaching out to Hope Services is when law enforcement first intercedes or is first on scene and is doing their investigation. So we're putting those two things together, and we're saying to law enforcement, when you look at this circumstance and the risk is high, you need to take that step to identify and connect that person. So the training was really critical to get them to understand, here's the things we want you to do to determine risk, and then here's the number that you need to encourage this person to call right now. If we wait 24 hours, if we wait sometimes even 2 hours, they won't call. So we're trying to make that connection so much sooner. And then we talk about making sure that the victim has an opportunity to have a safety plan made, and a little bit about what a safety plan is, but those connections are really huge. So we're excited about how we're going to move forward with that. And I do want to say one more thing about the training. The state attorney's office has been fantastic in looking at training that helps us to move beyond probable cause. What an officer needs to initially make an arrest is not nearly what they need later on to win a case in court. So we're looking at strengthening our investigations, being more thorough, capturing more evidence that's going to be usable just beyond the arrest circumstance.
One of those key things is being able to have counselors or facilities like Hope where they have a kind of a strength of purpose, where you have trained counselors saying it's okay to talk, or it's okay to make a statement, it's okay, you know, to move out. Those are key issues to help someone who's been battered, isn't it?
Well, I'm going to let Laurel have a couple. She'll give her viewpoint, and I'll give a law enforcement viewpoint. So.
We don't always agree on everything, Mr. Clapsaddle, but
most everything. Yeah.
But you know, one of the things that we talk about is we are victim-centered. Our job is to help that person who comes through our doors with whatever their choice is. And sometimes they choose not to involve law enforcement for a variety of reasons.
Right.
I mean, one of the things, just this weekend I was having a conversation in a social setting, and this acquaintance of mine said, well, if she's not willing to call the cops and she's not going to prosecute and blah, 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 well, you know, why should we as a community take this seriously? I said, well, that's simple. That would be nice if it didn't have an impact on everybody else in the community. But oh, by the way, there's still kids in these families witnessing their parents, doing this behavior. So we understand that sometimes people don't want to follow up with law enforcement for a variety of reasons. They're afraid. That's probably the top of the list. He has said, if you call the cops, I'll get out sometime. They're not going to keep me in jail forever, and I will kill you. And as it turns out, they sometimes do. Or I'll take the children. Or she has no means of support. He is the breadwinner. So when she says we don't want to involve law enforcement, or I'm not going to follow through with those charges, we understand that. We go back to, okay, so let's talk about a safety plan. Because if he's not in jail, you're not safe. So what do we do to keep you safe while he's out and about? And we do, the best we can to work within those confines. I mean, in a perfect world, I wish they would all be arrested, locked up, because it is a crime. I mean, that's the thing I keep coming back to. This is a crime. You can't turn around and slug me. I can't slug you. But suddenly, because this is behind closed doors and they're a couple, they're a partnership, everybody acts differently about the criminal nature of it. It's a crime. You can't go around slugging people. So,
Major, from your perspective.
Well, and what we're trying to get the law enforcement officers to understand is, first of all, the dynamics, because it's very frustrating for them when the victim doesn't follow through, when they put their life on the line, they go in there, they gather the evidence, they feel like they're making an arrest, they're giving the victim that opportunity to have some time to perhaps go and get an injunction or do something more helpful to themselves, and the officer gets very frustrated when they're right back together. And now I'm back out at this call 2 days later, and it's very frustrating to them. So we want them to understand the dynamics, and we also want them to understand the importance of making a case without the victim's cooperation, because in 95% or higher of the cases, the victim is not going to cooperate. So
98%.
It can be that high.
Wow.
So it's at least 95 or higher.
Wow.
So we are all about now, and we talk about the fact that we make cases all the time in homicides without a victim, sometimes even without a body. So we just want the officer to have a better understanding that you have to remove that feeling that you have, the angst that you have towards the victim for not cooperating, move beyond that and just do the job that needs to be done in collecting the evidence and moving forward without the victim. Because the dynamics are so powerful for the length of time this person has been subjected to what they've been going through.
And there's children involved,
yes, exactly.
Economic reasons. I mean, I can understand the burden that would be on an individual, but from a law enforcement standpoint, if you see someone that's been battered, sometimes, the point of hospitalization, you're looking at this as a crime, and that crime should be charged, and that's from your perspective.
And not in every instance is law enforcement even aware that some of these battering incidences have occurred before. Maybe this incident now that they're responding to, maybe 2 weeks ago the victim was battered and might have even been hospitalized, but it didn't get to law enforcement's attention. But now they're responding, and maybe the victim understands what's happened in the past, but they don't. So we're trying to give them some tools by which they can look at the bigger picture. It's not just always about that one moment in time. These people live together, and there are dynamics that are at play here that the officer needs to know. It's a bigger picture. So we want all of that information, and we want them to assess it on a larger scale.
And unfortunately, when these incidents result in a fatality, as they often do, that's when this new domestic violence fatality review team goes into action. Can you tell us a little bit about the partners involved in that, not only from the Sheriff's Department, but from Hope Family Services? Who are some of the other parts of the review team that you put your information together with?
We look at, law enforcement brings any previous reports. We've had fatality review team meetings where the arresting officer has been there, or someone who had sort of frontline personal knowledge. The clerk's office representative comes and talks about whether or not previous injunctions for protection, what's commonly called a restraining order, if there are any of those, were they filed, if filed, granted, denied, what were the circumstances. We had one where a woman had gotten an injunction, dismissed it, reconciled, and when she tried to get a subsequent one, it was denied. Now, I'm not saying that was the reason, I don't know, but what we do know is English wasn't her first language. There were lots of complications. She had a preteen daughter at the time of this, trying to get the injunction, young lady trying to translate and figure out legal documents, not the best way to go about it. Needless to say, it was not granted. She is deceased. That was one of the ones we talked about. So the clerk's office person who could give us that background information was new information for us, new information for the sheriff's department. That was a big deal, you know, bringing that component in. The medical examiner, Dr. Vega, has joined us. He talks about things like the manner of death, weapons used. I mean, that's one of the
Drug
things.
or alcohol use.
That's right. One of the things we've learned is that most often, certainly not 100%, most often it's a gunshot wound or a knife. Again, not 100%, but a pattern that you can't help. Somebody is typically not beaten with a fist or something like that. It's usually some object. Who else is there? We have the probation department. So were either of these parties on probation? And we've talked about, in one case, a different one that we staffed, we found out through the process in our meeting that the decedent was very active in her church. So she was a woman of color. And so one of the things we discussed internally at this meeting, which is completely confidential, we all sign a confidentiality agreement, but one of the things we just talked about is, gee, I wonder if she had gone to her pastor, because it's not unusual for women of color to talk to somebody. It's about trust. Who do you trust? Right. And so if you're big, you know, the church is a very big part of your life and you trust that pastor, maybe that's who you went to talk about. Maybe not. So I reached out separate after the meeting, before we sent the form, and everybody knew. I mean, I wasn't doing it sort of in secret or anything. Right. I said, let me see if I can, I know that person, let me see if I can just ask a quick question, because the fatality review team meeting is over, unless we want to postpone it, have another one, which, you know, we were through the crux of it. So, and actually there was no prior knowledge. But that's one of the things as we go forward, you know, so we look at this individual case and say, who knew or who could have known? Who could have known? Maybe teachers or guidance counselors in schools should be involved. You know, it's fascinating stuff. One of the ones that same case that we discussed, everybody is looking at the perpetrator because the partner's dead, right? So you're the perpetrator. And what I brought to the table, with this person's permission, she had been our client. And in fact, she had been a victim for many, many years and decided at some point a line in the sand and fought back. Well, that's what Major was saying, is that, you know, officers are sometimes called, you know, 2 or 3 different occasions. They're dealing with, you know, repeat type of things, and they're not seeing any kind of forward progress in trying to settle the huge issue, which is the violence. I have a question, and it's for both of you, and I'll direct it to the Major first. You know, where do the children fit into this? Because obviously children in the home are being subjected, perhaps, you know, sometimes to the physical violence, but they're seeing the violence occur within the home. Is there kind of a reaching out to, you know, see how one can help with dealing with children, especially in these kind of dire circumstances? Yes, and we do, in our training, we're focusing on the fact that children can be really good witnesses, and it's important. They're eyewitnesses and ear witnesses to what's happening in that home setting, and it's really important for the officers to interact with them, if for nothing else, to make sure that they know it's not their fault, that they didn't do anything wrong, because oftentimes children do think that this is all something to do with what they've done. So we're training the officers to communicate with the children, to put that information in the report, because actually, if we don't intercede, they become the future abusers and the future victims for domestic violence. So law enforcement also has, in a separate hat-wearing situation, they're mandatory reporters of child abuse, and witnessing domestic violence in the home setting is a form of child abuse that has to be called into the hotline. So the officer has to understand that as a mandatory reporter and you know, children present,
if they made an arrest or could have made an arrest and the person fled, they have to make that call to the hotline. They don't really have a choice. And that gives an opportunity for these children to perhaps receive some counseling. We also reach out to the school systems when we make an arrest so that the school is aware, so that when this child comes in the next day, perhaps acting out in some manner or sleeping in class or just behaving differently, that the child isn't punished for that behavior, that they understand, that
The circumstances.
Yes, exactly, and that they can deal appropriately with the child. So that's how law enforcement is dealing with children in the home setting. And looking for evidence of injury. Many times kids get caught in the middle. They try to protect the mother or they're the pawn. We had an instance where a baby was taken, and when we talk about the danger to an infant, the person getting in the vehicle and leaving with the baby, and the danger to the infant at that point. And having the officers focus on things differently just to understand all the total picture.
Well, I would think, and I've heard Laurel speak on this, the children are sometimes, a sad result of domestic violence between the mother and the father, or boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever. And those children, as you said, Major, act out. They become future. They're
going to have
they
a host of
respond to the
problems.
behavior that they're seeing and things. So, Laurel, what is your take on?
Well,
on
if I
kind of
can
the
add something, you have interviewed the Major and I before, and when it comes to the kids, sometimes we disagree respectfully, because I used to have this opinion that sort of saying to a mom, well, if you don't keep your kids safe, by golly, I'm going to keep your kids safe. And I thought, well, that's, I can't stop him. Gee whiz, Major Shingledecker, you're a gun. You can have a gun. You're a law enforcement officer. You can't stop him, but we expect her to stop him. But I realized that is my thinking was in one silo. Here I want to protect battered women and their kids and battered men. And the Sheriff's Department has to follow the statute, which is to protect the kids. And if there's bad behavior, for lack of a better way to put it, in a family, that has to be examined. So what we've done, because I stopped butting my head against a wall, we have a CPI advocate. CPI is the Child Protective Investigation Unit of the Sheriff's Department.
And they work closely with you.
We have somebody now in there with them that's a HOPE advocate. Kim, who you've met, Kim Donatelli.
Absolutely.
She's fantastic. So the whole goal is, okay, not every report that they respond to is a domestic violence. Those, there's neglect, lots of drug abuse. From what I understand, prescription pills are kind of leading the charge on that one. Folks are having trouble parenting when they're high. But when there's a domestic violence case, just like we've learned through the fatality review team that law enforcement has a narrow window of opportunity to affect change, there they are on the scene. She's upset. Hey, have you ever thought to call HOPE? Well, now here's a CPI advocate at that same critical juncture in the beginning who can say to someone, this isn't your fault, but let's lay out, here's what happens in this system.
Here are some specific
If you don't
options.
protect your children, I mean, I got to tell you, she's very direct. If you don't, whether you like it or not, they're going to. And let me tell you what this looks like. So at least for the first time, instead of just what I used to call throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we at least have a chance to have a conversation. Now, we are more successful than others, but boy, we are just in there on the front line, or Kim is. When I say we, I don't mean me. I'm too old and grumpy, but she does a great job.
But how important, how critical is that to have that type of individual, trained individual, right there at the moment when it's needed?
Well, let me tell you how helpful it is. Domestic violence was the second most common reason we used to remove children. And substance abuse is number one. It has been number one and continues to be number one. Well, domestic violence removals have completely dropped because of the fact that we have this individual up front and interacting with that mother and having the support in place so we've actually had to remove fewer children for domestic-related incidences, which is huge. When you look at other counties around, that's probably the second most common reason that children are being removed is domestic violence. And fortunately, in Manatee, because we have this great working relationship, we are removing fewer children for that specific reason.
And I would think that from a mother's perspective, having gone through a domestic violence incident, having the threat of having their children removed just adds to that pressure and angst and fear that is there. Now, Major and Laura, we're kind of running a little short on time, and I want to give both of you an opportunity. My first question, though, is has this made changes in Manatee County? Are we doing better than we were? Are we? Is this fatality review team making an impact, and can it make an impact in Manatee County? Major?
Absolutely.
What's your thoughts?
It has. I mean, we've already, just in the review of the few cases that we've looked at in the last couple of years, we've made huge strides in better working relationships, training our officers, looking at a variety of different things that we've already talked about. The clerk's office is now they have an advocate that's going to be helping with the Spanish-speaking population, because they understand the importance of that, because that's sort of a missing piece. So I think that I can say that we're doing some really good work here in Manatee County, and it's making a difference.
Thank you, Major. Laurel, from your perspective?
Well, I think I would echo everything that the Major said. The other thing that we haven't really talked about, and just a snippet, one of the things law enforcement's also being trained on that is new information for many of the frontline folks in the field is how to identify who the primary aggressor is. And that is huge from our perspective, because
why is that? Why
here
is
is
that
this
important?
case that we reviewed that everyone up until this moment is looking at the woman who pulled the trigger and killed her partner, same-sex relationship, very difficult to tell who the primary aggressor is, because we are gender biased about this issue. It's not a gender neutral issue. And so they're looking at her, if you will, the one who pulled the trigger, as the bad guy. And in fact, she was a victim who finally, after eons of abuse in her entire life, fought back.
So you're saying that from both law enforcement, from your perspective, while somebody might react to the violence, they're not necessarily, they're in a defense mode, perhaps, or kind of reacting?
Please note, I don't condone what she did. I mean, she still is murdered somebody.
Well, let me give you an example, and this is the one, an example I will somewhat use to law enforcement. Let's say that 3 weeks ago she was battered so badly that she was hospitalized, and law enforcement, for whatever reason, didn't get called, and maybe the hospital didn't pick up on it, and she lied about what her injuries, how she received her injuries, and so forth. Now fast forward, we're out there on a call, maybe a neighbor called it in, and but what's happening this time is she knows that it's about to happen. She knows, she has the prior knowledge of what happened before, and she pulls a knife and says, "Not today. You're not battering me again today." Now, so far we've got words and maybe an approach on his part, and I'll say he as the perpetrator, and she pulls the knife out. Now, if the officer arrives and doesn't look at the big picture, who goes to jail? She does, because she pulled the knife out, and she's going to have to say, "Well, yes, I did, and here's the knife," and, "Well, why would you do that?" "Well, I thought he was going to hit me." "Well, he didn't hit," and is that the appropriate response to just a verbal, So we were trying to get the officers to understand you have to look at the bigger picture. It's not just that moment in time, it's the bigger picture. And so getting them to think beyond, or even if there were two folks that were battering one another, look at the height and weight, and look at who has a more severe injury, who's been more injured in the past, so that you can understand the dynamics.
It's a delicate balance out
is.
there, when, especially from an investigating officer's point of view, to understand all of those dynamics, the past, the present, and what could happen.
Exactly.
Right. So, Major, what would you like Manatee County to know about the domestic violence fatality review team? What do you think is the most critical thing that this community should know?
Well, I want them to know that this is a group of people coming together with a common cause to look at preventing future domestic violence deaths, and that we set aside all of our egos and we talk candidly across the table, and there is no finger pointing. And I do want them to know that it's with the spirit of making this a better place to live and reducing domestic violence homicides. That's what it's all about.
Thank you, Major. And Laurel, what are your thoughts that you would like this community to know about not only Hope Family Services, but about this effort?
I am so proud of us for doing this. Not every community has this. We have made great strides, and the relationships that we've built through this process makes our community a more safe place to live, and that's good for everybody. And so I just echo what the Major said. It's been a phenomenal experience, and I just want anyone who may think they need help even if you're not sure, you're kind of on the fence, please pick up the phone. Statewide, 95% of the people who are battered or a fatality never contact their local certified center. So that tells me what we're doing is working, because it's not our clients getting killed. But the bad news is, why aren't we getting these other folks in? So I would implore someone who just want information, call us.
And that's
It's
a good
easy.
point. If you just want to find out some information or some background to see what options are open, they can call Hope Family Services and say, well,
24
this
hours
is...
a day, anonymously. Just
And we
let us
have
give
that
you some
number up on the screen, so people can
Perfect.
call. Even if it doesn't involve them, it involves a neighbor or somebody in their family, they can call and say, listen, we know this is going on. What do you think we should do? And your staff is more than willing and outreaching to provide great information.
The bottom line is they are all trained to do a safety plan, in person, on the phone. I know how to do it, we all do, because safety plans save lives, and that's the key.
Well, Laurel, Major Shingledecker, I want to thank you very much for taking the opportunity to talk about this. And I would extend the opportunity to come back at perhaps some other time to talk about some of the other initiatives and some of the other things that you're doing to help protect families in this community. And again, thank you, Major Shingledecker, and thank you, Laurel, for joining us on the special edition of Up Close on METV. Thank you for joining us.